can hear from Things That Matter. I'm glad you could be with me today to talk a little bit about something that interests me, but may not interest you, but I'm hoping that it will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the right wing's attitude towards anything to do with race, and how we as a society need to become more and more aware of how these issues impact all of us. And we also need to be aware as to the issues that are presented from others that may or may not be accurate. I guess it's important under every circumstance to at least to be able to evaluate what's happening and to make decisions about whether or not it fits with us or not. Now, some of you who have watched our previous videos, of which there are very few unfortunately, will know that I do have an issue around one Alan Jones, who in my opinion represents the right wing, the part of our society which often misrepresents actually what's happening in our society, and the aspects which are generally rather distorted. So I've got a couple of examples of these types of distortions today, and I'll run through them with you. So join with us while we have this conversation around things that really do matter. So I've just got a short snap of something that Jones said that I particularly take objection to, but it does particularly get us to understand, I guess, where he stands and some of the things that he believes are important.
Well, down to business. I'm certain I'm not the only one to be fed up to the back teeth with this Black Lives Matter mob.
So there we go. He's fed up to his back teeth with this Black Lives Matters mob. So what does this mean? I guess one of the concerns I have is that often the things that these people tend to say are tropes. They stoke racial prejudice in our society. And I did wonder as to whether or not they're full of any relevant facts whatsoever. So I thought I'd have a look at some of the things that he goes on to further say in this particular Fox News clip, and see whether or not we can take it apart, start to look at things a little bit differently than the way he does. I'm not suggesting for a moment that there are aspects of some of the things that Alan Jones says that we shouldn't look at, because there are, and in these following clips you'll see what I mean. I'll just break up some of these clips and we'll have a further chat about some of the things that he says as we go along.
The Greens should change their colour to Marxist red. This defiant behaviour, though, sickens decent Australians. No points, though.
So don't you like the way that he says that that the Greens should change their colours to Marxist red? I don't know if there's any member of the Greens party who necessarily sees them as a Marxist. So, but because you are, how can I put it? Because you think differently to the way he does, and you're progressive in nature, somehow you're a Marxist. I'm sure that there would be people out there who may even think that I am, because I am progressive, I guess, in my thinking. In other words, I think about the wider community, particularly those people that are very disadvantaged in terms of poverty, mental well-being, domestic violence, child protection issues. They're all issues that concern me. Does that mean because I want to advocate for those people who don't normally have a voice that I am Marxist? I guess according to Alan Jones, it kind of does. And to me, that is somewhat distressing. So because you have a different view from him, he must go to the extreme and consequently say that you're Marxist. So let's see what else he might have to say.
Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt, normally a very sensible fellow, in asking people not to protest for public health reasons, he talked about, quote, the absolute nobility of their cause. You kidding me? A couple of points first. The death of George Floyd in America wasn't a front.
So it's interesting here that when he talks about Hunt, that Hunt is, because he's a liberal and a conservative, he has to say that he likes him. So that's nice. But does he like him to the extent that he's prepared to give him credit for the things that he says? No, he's not. He criticises him for saying that the Black Lives Matter movement have a point, and that because they have that point, that they therefore should have rallies and should have protests and do the things that they do. But according to Jones, that particular position is untenable because they disagree with him.
humanity. No one condones that. And the right to protest, of course, is central to a democratic society. It's called freedom of speech, which unfortunately is denied to most if they're not from the left. Nonetheless, in all
I love this bit that we can that protests are available to everybody, providing they apply to the left. But if you're right wing and extreme right, like let's say, who could you be? You could be Nazi, you could be white supremacist, you could be any one of those particular groups. And if you were, of course, you don't have the right to protest. Well, that's not true. You do have the right to protest. It's just that those extreme views are met with often, not always violence, but those particular groups often encourage violence. But there would be a number of people standing on the other side who would be arguing against their particular point of view. So because you take that stand, you then don't have the right to protest, as do those people apparently on the left, even though we must note that recently some people who were on the left didn't get an opportunity to protest because there were COVID restrictions and the courts didn't rule that appropriate. So it doesn't always happen, of course, but somehow the right are getting are just not receiving the same benefits as the left, which is in itself somewhat concerning, apparently, according to...
The freedom of one individual has to be weighed up against the limits imposed by the law and the freedom of others to live without enduring unnecessary risk imposed by others. But even that's not the most important point, because these protests are based on palpable untruths. But now to the lies.
So we're talking about palpable untruths. So he had up there, I think, do all lives matter or only Black Lives Matter. And so what the right want to do is to transpose their own prejudices, it seems to me, over the rights of a minority in order to have their voice heard. And in the United States, of course, it's concerning the number of deaths by police, and in Australia it's particularly about the number of incarcerations of Aboriginal people. And I think, and no one can deny, I guess, to some extent, that both those minorities have a right to protest. Of course they do. And in the United States, they've been dealing with this issue for over 200 years, and they have a history of racism. Here in Australia, our history may not appear to be that apparent. However, it is still there. We didn't have a civil war to free Indigenous people. We had to wait till 1966, and they cleared the nexus in the Senate in order for that to happen, so that Aboriginal people were recognised and able to vote. So we have our own challenges, and our history around Indigenous people isn't told anywhere near enough to help us to understand what the first Australians had to encounter here in this country. So when he starts talking about and differentiating between black lives and all lives, of course all lives matter. You know, only an idiot would suggest anything contrary, and therefore he probably ranks in the idiot category, because we know that in this case we're standing up for and advocating for black lives because they're the ones that are clearly disadvantaged. And I'll talk to you about that further in just a moment.
Black lives matter because white people and police don't care about black people. The latest American Department of Justice figures on crime indicate that the number of black or African American victims...
This is not about white people not caring about black people. That's another trope. That's another effort to sideline the real issue, which is about the inadequacies and the inequities that sit amongst a minority group of people. It's not about white people not liking black people. I think that is an atrocious thing to say, and just so false. In fact, we know that at many of these rallies, whether in the US or here, there were lots of white people who were there to support them, to support Indigenous people about their claim for a sense of equity and fairness in the judicial system, which they clearly do not have. And the statistics go to bear this out. But let's hear more about the mighty Jones and what he further has to say.
Murder on the latest statistics were 2,870. In only 243 cases was the offender white. In 2,570 cases, the offender was black or African American. That is the truth. That is the fact.
That is not the truth. Not the truth in terms of what he is trying to tell us. Because what he's trying to say is that what he's trying to skew the argument around Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is about black people and Hispanic people being killed in a disproportionate manner to white people. And that fact is true, that they are. There is no disputing any of that. In fact, I'm about to show you some statistics that I found that prove that. But what we do have here is we have Jones trying to convince us that because the number of black people killed by black people somehow is the primary issue. Violence in the United States is a primary issue. There's no disputing that. When one looks at the number of deaths in Chicago a weekend ago, we do wonder, I wonder about that. But that has more to do with a society that is infatuated with guns than it is about the Black Lives Matter movement and the number of police who kill black Americans. So I do have some stats here that are worth looking at. Right. So in these stats, we can see you can see here that there are a number of if we just look at the figures for 2019, we will see that in 2019 there were 235 black people that were killed. There were 370 whites, and there were 158 Hispanic people. But when we have a look at the number of black people in the population, that is 13.4%. So 13.4% of black Americans were killed, way out of proportion to the number of white people that were killed. And then we can look at Hispanic people, which are 16.7% of the population. So both of them make up 30% of the population, and clearly we can see from these figures that it's way out of proportion to the number of whites that were killed by, these are death by police. Death by police. We can see by these facts that the number of people that are killed is outrageous. And definitely, when you think about Black Lives Matter and these sorts of statistics, you can see the issues that are presented. And so what we have here also is we have our friend and buddy go on to further talk about the impact that this has on also Indigenous people. So he starts moving the argument from Black Lives Matter and the American situation to that of Australians. So let's see what he has to say further here.
These protests are based on untruths. I can understand protesters fiddling with the truth, but there's no excuse for political leaders to be silent about what Donald Trump would call fake news. So I've said many times, every death diminishes us all. But in 89.5% of the murders of black or African Americans, the offender was black or African American.
We will accept that in the United States that the number of deaths is unacceptable. We know that, we accept it right across the board. Blacks killing blacks, Hispanics killing blacks, blacks killing Hispanics, whatever it might be, blacks killing whites, whites killing black, whatever it might be. The violence is unacceptable, but that is not what this movement is about, and we need to be clear about that.
American fact. So what are these protests about in Australia? Indigenous Australians. If people think by jumping on the bandwagon they're supporting Aboriginal Australians, well, they are not. Simple question. How many of these people would ever put their hand in their own pocket to help an Australian in need, let alone an Indigenous Australian? Well, I'm sorry, I have. And I'm...
Well, actually, Alan, I'm sorry you have too, because there's nothing, you didn't tell us what it was that you did by putting your hand in your pocket. I could be rude about it, but I won't. But on the other hand, there is no indication that you've done anything significant, or that I know about at least, but you can certainly let us know what you've done that is significantly going to assist Indigenous people to have a better life. So here he goes on more, changing the subject and making it all about himself.
Sick and tired of protesters ignoring the truth about Indigenous Australia. The first truth is this: there are real problems in Indigenous communities. Aboriginal women and children are suffering because of sexual abuse and family violence. But the truth is, Aboriginal people are dying.
Don't you like the way he keeps saying the truth is? So here's the arbiter of truth. None of us kind of know what the truth is unless God Jones is telling us what the truth is. And I would not argue with him that the issues that there are in Indigenous communities in terms of domestic violence, mental health, sexual abuse and so on are not of concern. Of course they are. We're all concerned about them, particularly as someone here that runs the Child Protection Party. We are very, very concerned about all of those issues and how they impact Indigenous people. But, you know, the claim that he's about to make is that this is not a white problem. Well, the fact is that it is. And as he wants us all to believe that us white people are generously giving financially to this problem and never being able to rectify it, maybe he needs to start to realise that one of the problems here is that us white people actually don't know the solution to the problem, but think we do and think we're superior than those people with whom we're trying to help. So here he is trying to justify the white position and what it is that we should know are the facts.
At a far greater rate at the hands of other Aboriginal people. That is a fact. The latest Australian Institute of Criminology statistics shows 70% of the 765 homicides involving an Indigenous person in the 22 years to 2012 were committed by an Indigenous person. 70%. That is a fact. Yet these protests vilify police. Only through the support of police and authorities can these appalling circumstances in Aboriginal communities be addressed. How to maligned white Australia.
That is so much crap. That only through police. No. Well, yes, but no. You know, the reality is that the problems that exist are systemic within that community, and that that community, knows how to resolve them. The problem is that we fail to ask them and fail to provide, I guess, in a paternal, regretfully sort of way, the authority to be able to govern their own affairs. Plus the fact that poverty, you know, is the primary problem for Indigenous communities, and we have created that problem by us firstly invading this country, and secondly by once we've invaded it, by destroying Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, and moving them further and further inland where they have nothing. So we have created the problem. We need to take responsibility for just that simple fact, and that we need to be able to offer an opportunity for Indigenous people to be able to talk to and resolve their own issues. And it is not about throwing them money, which is his argument about the wonderful thing that us white people do for black people.
Australians help. Well over $30 billion a year of taxpayers' money is spent on closing the gap. Indigenous Australians receive approximately $10 billion in welfare payments. That's almost $14,000 per person a year. Non-Indigenous Australians receive about $6,000. Then there are millions of dollars to Indigenous communities through mining royalties. So why do Australians have to cop these constant attacks about being racist?
Keep telling white Australians that we don't have racist policies, when in actual fact we do. All you need to do is look at some of these incarceration rates in Australia and look at the number of Indigenous people that are incarcerated, and you're going to be thinking, well, there's something wrong here somewhere. Unless we're looking at the problem and trying to rectify it, then it will always remain just a problem. And if we're like you, we stick our head in the sand and ignore it and make out that it's everybody else's problem but ours, but you, Alan Jones, the white person, because it's not your problem, because you've put your hand in your pocket and you've just, you know, dealt out millions of dollars for Indigenous people. Well done, good for you. But this is what you've done, because you're amazing. And then I'll finish with this, though, that they occupy 2% of the population, but constitute 27% of the national population. Now, that in itself should be a concern to all of us who care about our fellow humans. This is a major concern. So we need to be able to be aware of it enough to be able to offer our politicians and our first Australians an opportunity for both parties to rectify what has been a disservice to a minority group of people. 2% occupy 20%. This came from the government. I can tell you where it came from, Mr. Jones. In 2016, around 20 in every 1,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were incarcerated. And this is an overrepresentation, a staggering overrepresentation, where almost a third of all incarcerations are Indigenous. And the question really is, what are we doing? I'll put it back up for those of you to look at. But the question is, what are we doing to rectify this problem, to change it, and to make a difference in our society? And one of the things we definitely need to do is stop listening to people like Mr. Jones. Thanks, everybody, for being with me on Things That Matter. I hope I can catch up with you next time. Remember, if you can, please subscribe, and that will make a world of difference to the number of people that actually get to see who we are and share us, of course, naturally. Thanks, everybody. Take care.